So I would now like to introduce our keynote speaker, Mike Bader. Michael G. Bader, independent consultant, has nearly 40 years of experience in natural resource management and policy, including fieldwork as a seasonal ranger at Yellowstone National Park, involved in grizzly bear research and management and wildland fire. He has also worked as a wilderness guide and naturalist in several wild areas. He has authored and co-authored several papers published in science journals and law reviews on threatened and endangered species science, law, and management. He was the lead author of the petition for bull trout listing under the Endangered Species Act and personally negotiated the consent decree with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, designating critical habitat in the lower 48 states. He has professionally reviewed dozens of federal proposals and pieces of congressional legislation, and has formally been requested to give oral testimony before the U.S. House of Representatives and the U.S. Senate on many occasions. He has made numerous professional presentations at the University of Montana, University of Oregon, University of Colorado, and Georgetown University Law Schools, and at conferences nationwide. So welcome, Mike. Thanks so much for your report and your dedication, and we really appreciate you being here. You're on mute right now, Mike.
Am I unmuted?
You're unmuted.
All right, thanks. A pleasure to be here with you. And good to see a lot of people I haven't seen in quite some time. We had some technical difficulties that we resolved literally at 6:30. So Adam's going to forward my slides for me. Unfortunately, I won't be able to point out things with my cursor, and you'll have to hear me say next quite a few times. But what I would start out by saying is that I was hired to conduct an analysis of the Gallatin Forest Partnership Agreement and the Custer-Gallatin National Forest Revised Forest Plan. And the Gallatin Range in southwest Montana is a vital component of the greater Yellowstone ecosystem. It is the largest unprotected area north of Yellowstone National Park. It supports 99% of the vertebrate species native to the area and is home to the Gallatin elk herd. Next, please. The focus of my report was primarily the Gallatin Range, including the highlight Porcupine Buffalo Horn Wilderness Study Area and the adjacent roadless areas believed to comprise 230,000 acres. This is the Buffalo Horn, beautiful habitat for wildlife. I've been there myself before. It's been a long time, but I've been in the Gallatin Petrified Forest and down Buffalo. Next, please. The Porcupine Creek is another drainage that's part of that same, considered kind of that same part of the Gallatin Range. Next. South Cottonwood, it's adjacent roadless area to the WSA. Next. Ramshorn Peak and Ramshorn Lake area. Next. The Upper Highlight Creek drainage, some of that is in the WSA. Next. And the West Pine that Joe mentioned, which as you can see is more rolling open terrain, which is really valuable for wildlife at some of the more lower elevation habitat. Next, please. One of the things I found impressive in looking through the history of this is just how long it is. You know, it started in 1872 with the Yellowstone Park Act. You got Gifford Pinchot advocating for the Southern Gallatins and the state of Montana and so forth. And, you know, one of the things that always kind of plagued management of the area was the inholdings that were left over from the railroad land grant days. So you can kind of see that, but one of the key things obviously was 1977 and the Montana Wilderness Study Areas Act that established the WSA in the Gallatins. And then the Lee Metcalf Act authorized a land exchange. And so that eventually happened. Next, please. So the Wilderness Study Areas Act requires that the Forest Service maintain the presently existing wilderness character and potential for inclusion in the National Wilderness Preservation System. That's very important. Next. One of the big resources of the Gallatin Range is its elk. And one of the things that at the time of the land exchange bill, the director of the Montana Fish, Wildlife and Parks testified that 70% of the winter range for the Gallatin elk herd is provided in the Gallatin Range, and of the ones that summer in Yellowstone National Park. And it has winter range for the highest concentrations of wintering moose in the Gallatin, Madison, and Yellowstone drainages. Next, please. This is a map from the Wyoming Migration Initiative. And you can really, if you can orient yourself there just north of Yellowstone Park, you can see the Gallatin Range, and you can see that there's a large herd in the part of the Gallatins that's in Yellowstone Park. And then those elk migrate out into the Gallatin Range. And then you also have the Paradise Valley herd there. So it's pretty important for elk. Next, please. This was a very interesting study that I went through by Dr. Frank Lance Craighead that really looked at comprehensively all the wilderness and wildlife and ecological values. Next, please. And not just for elk, but for cutthroat trout. Next. Moose. Next. And of course, grizzly bears, which have really started to expand their distribution in the Gallatin Range. Next, please. And here you can see what we see here is both the demographic monitoring area where births and deaths are counted to track the population trends, and also occupied grizzly bear habitat. So the Gallatin Range has both of that. Next, please. This again is from Dr. Craighead. He's really been a pioneer in looking at potential pathways for grizzly bears between the different ecosystems. And the red there is the highest value for connectivity and migration. And you can see that just runs right through the Gallatin Range. And that's the shortest path between Yellowstone and the Northern Continental Divide ecosystem. Next, please. And that's really important because conservation biologists and geneticists believe we probably need north of 2,500 and maybe as many as 5,000 grizzly bears in a single population or metapopulation. And of course, the greater Yellowstone population has been isolated for over 100 years. And so expanding and linking core areas is the central aim of trying to recover grizzlies. Next, please. And so this is a map that I put together, but if you look at the Gallatin Range there, you can see that linkage that Dr. Craighead pointed out. And then the other most direct route is through the Madison Range. So that whole northwest corner there is of great importance. Next, please. So when we think about connectivity, it really isn't a sprint by males between the recovery areas. And, you know, there was some research done a few years back, and they did something like 20,000 simulations, and no bear made it between GYE and the NCDE, but that isn't really how it works. It's more of a relay between stepping stones of secure core habitats that are inhabited by females and males, and then, you know, the offspring can disperse to the next so-called stepping stone. Next, please. So an unbroken wilderness, when we, again, going back to the checkerboard and trying to get past that obstacle to wilderness, at that time, the Wilderness Society and the Greater Yellowstone Coalition submitted testimony, and you can read it for yourself, but the key thing is it would provide an unbroken wilderness from just south of Bozeman to Yellowstone National Park. Next, please. This is a part of a proposal that the Greater Yellowstone Coalition submitted to Congress in testimony on the Northern Rockies Ecosystem Protection Act. And you could see that they were promoting that view of an unbroken wilderness from just south of Bozeman all the way down to the park. Next, please. This is a nice map from the Wilderness Society. And it really, if you look on the left, you can see how that checkerboard ownership had just really made a mess of things. And after the passage of the Consolidation Act, you can see the WSA is unified, and that particular obstacle to wilderness designation had been removed. And so the potential for the unbroken wilderness had been enacted. Next, please. So just a couple years back, Dr. Reed Noss, who's a leading conservation biologist, in fact, he was a former editor of the scientific journal Conservation Biology, and he got over 100 top scientists and conservation leaders, and they were advocating for all 230,000 plus acres of wilderness in the Gallatin Range be designated. And you can see the heavy hitters there: Bruce Babbitt, Mike Finley, and several former influential people and leaders within the Greater Yellowstone Coalition. Next. So one of the key findings of Dr. Craighead's report was that fragmenting the wilderness study area into smaller pieces of protected habitat could really diminish its value for wildlife habitat. And so I think that's important. Next. But unfortunately, both the Gallatin Forest Partnership Agreement and the revised Custer-Gallatin Plan do break it up into different pieces. And so I'll address the designations on the left in the partnership agreement. And it states, in terms of porcupine buffalo horn, they were proposing it as a wildlife management area, but it states one of the primary purposes of wildlife management areas is to maintain the presently existing wilderness character of the area. But despite it being part of the GFP members' previous wilderness proposals, it does not protect, they don't recommend it all for wilderness in this plan, and rather the focus is on maintaining recreational access. And I'll quote directly from their agreement, including mountain biking, motorcycling, hiking, horseback riding, cross-country skiing, and snowmobiling. Many of these are non-conforming uses in wilderness. I do have to say straight out that the proposal in the wildlife management areas from the GFPA would prohibit commercial timber harvest and new road construction. Now, West Pine, we see that up in the northeast corner. That's also a wildlife management area, but it allows active management, quote, to reduce wildfire hazards in the wildland-urban interface. And I really feel that that's an abuse of that definition. And there's been a lot of leading fire scientists lately that are calling the Forest Service on trying to sell remote area timber sales as wildfire mitigation. And, it's a wilderness study area. I don't think you can really say it's part of the urban interface. There may be private property adjacent to it, but, that's the way it is. So I don't think that that kind of management is consistent with maintaining the presently existing wilderness character of the area. So with Highlight, that one was really pretty heavy on recreation, and it calls for the Forest Service to develop a fee-based system for all or part of the recreation area. And so that's how, some of the funding would be brought in to manage that. And finally, this proposed designation allows for active vegetation management straight out of the plan in areas outside the WSA to, quote, address watershed health and wildfire hazards, unquote. And according to the new NEPA regulations from the U.S. Forest Service, they can include commercial timber sales and categorically exclude them from the NEPA process. And those commercial timber sales were specifically aimed at fire salvage, wildfire mitigation, and restoration, same sorts of things that we see in the GFPA. Now, under recreation, The GFPA identifies 4 areas outside of their proposed designations, and they make management recommendations. These include the East Gallatin Front. This is some of the roadless that's adjacent to the WSA, and it's lower elevation and more important to wildlife, especially wintering wildlife. But again, it calls for logging in the guise of the wildland urban interface and opens all of the areas outside of the GFPA designations to, quote, all the tools in the toolkit, including timber harvest, unquote. And again, includes roadless areas. So switching to the right, the Custer-Gallatin Revised Forest Plan designates or recommends 78,000 acres of the 155,000 acre WSA compared to 92,000 acres in the GFPA. Much of the rest is designated as backcountry or recreation emphasis, while GFPA had recommended these areas be wildlife management areas. So the revised plan creates 3 different backcountry areas from out of the WSA, one in the Buffalo Horn Porcupine, one in the West Pine, and then there's another north of the WSA, there's a backcountry area in the South Cottonwood. Next, please. So yesterday I received a letter that the Gallatin Forest Partnership had sent to the Gallatin Yellowstone Wilderness Alliance. And I want to address not all of it, but the main points. They claim that I wrote that the Forest Service controlled the GFP. In fact, my report states the Forest Service did not establish the GFP and has been careful to keep an arm's length and vice versa. Yet it is clear they were delighted, as evidenced by the consistent praise from the forest supervisor. The GFP claims a backcountry designation in the Custer-Gallatin Revised Plan does not allow mining, roads, or logging, but direct quote from the plan, as you can see, there are exceptions to allow for reasonable access and mining activities, so on and so forth. So that means roads. That's the way it's interpreted in the courts. You know, they're not going to tell them you have to fly in by helicopter or pack in with a mule. And so the other thing is that it allows temporary roads in South Cottonwood. So that is roads, again, allowed in one of the backcountries. And then as you see here, the backcountry areas, while not suitable for timber production as part of the identified timber base, it includes timber harvest. And again, it's that catch-all, the fuels reduction, restoration, or wildlife habitat enhancement. Next, please. Now, one thing you have to realize is that most of the restoration projects on the Custer-Gallatin and other national forests are actually commercial timber sales, just under a different name. And so what that actually does in many ways is it sets the stage for what's kind of a common Region 1 trick of using site-specific forest plan amendments to allow access to project areas. Because if they're going to do timber harvest inside a roadless area, they have to get to it. And you just can't do restoration forestry with a helicopter. It's too expensive. And so the other thing you have to realize is that the Forest Service does not count salvage logging and restoration logging, fuels reduction as commercial timber harvest, and they don't count them towards the forest allowable annual sale quantity, but they're commercial timber sales. In fact, they're offered up, they're bid on, they're bought, they're sold, they're cut, and they're sent to the mill. Next, please. Now, the GFP also claims new trails are not allowed within the current bounds of the WSA, except the extensive new trail loop in West Pine, but it also states for the Porcupine Buffalo Horn area, immediately following completion of forest plan revision, conduct travel analysis for all trails within the PBH area, designate additional system trails as necessary, and allow no new trail construction following this process. So no new trails after new ones are added and or built, and they possibly could be adding illegal user-created roads to the official system. And that rewards illegal activities. And the other thing we've heard from GFP members in op-eds is that they didn't want to kick anybody off the land. And so for the past 35 years, illegal motorized and mechanized use is going on in the WSA. And the Forest Service turned a blind eye because they love it. It creates a traditional established use that will diminish prospects for being designated as wilderness, which leaves their discretion open to do things in the future, which I would think includes roads, because I've helped sue the Forest Service a lot of times, and I worked with Tim Bechtold as a paralegal on the Soldier Butler Challenge outside of Missoula, and they claimed that that was a wildfire reduction and restoration sale, but it was huge, and they don't follow their own forest plan, and they got hammered in court, and the federal judge literally said that they can't be taken at their word, that their interpretation of things, he said, was entitled to no deference whatsoever. So, I don't think it's right to grandfather in illegal uses. It just sort of rewards somebody for doing the wrong thing. Next, please. Now, one of the things the Gallatin Forest Partnership had said, it was somewhat patterned after the Whitefish Range Partnership. And here's what the, Wild Montana was part of this collaborative too. And what you can see is the roadless areas in the purple. This is the Whitefish Range right next to Glacier National Park, right inside a grizzly recovery area. And they only proposed the green part, and that's what the Forest Service adopted. And that's just going to be massive fragmentation. But they call it a big win. It's great because their partnership proposal got in the plan. Next, please. And we kind of see the same thing here. Again, the Forest Service didn't control, but I think that they were real happy to be able to get that kind of proposal that sort of set a low bar, and then they could come in lower than that. And so, it kind of sets the high bar for what wilderness might be in a legislation, because if Tester introduces it, he'll cut it down more, and he'll add more timber provisions and motorized use. It's just the way he does business. So, but then again, what do we get from GYC? It's a great plan, largely mirrors their plan, and it's a decisive win. And so designating 34% or recommending 34% of the Gallatin Range's roadless lands is a decisive win. And maybe so from that point of view. Next, please. So you kind of see the shrinking wilderness proposals, as what was known to be available then. And that kind of changed with GIS, better mapping, land exchanges. But MWA in 1986, 85%. GYC 1994, 100%. But then the GFPA, 40%. And the revised plan, 34%. So something really slipped seriously in the proposals that were made there. Next, please. And so, this is the opening shot of the GYC video. And it emphasizes recreation again. And so I think there's somewhat of a denial here on the recreational impact on native wildlife. Next, please. I kind of divided into desire and denial. You can see there's legendary Montana outfitter Smoke Elser and what he's observed about what's going on out there. In the denial part, all human use has impacts on wildlife, whether it's recreational or not. But numerous research studies really do show that ATVs and mountain biking have had the most displacement impact on elk, including Forest Service research. And the risk of a serious encounter with a grizzly bear while mountain biking is approximately 14 times that of hiking. Next, please. And one of the reasons for that, there was a Forest Service employee that collided with a female grizzly with cubs outside of Whitefish, and he was killed. Not surprisingly, hit her going 25 miles an hour right in the ribs. And that inquiry was chaired by Chris Servine, the former national grizzly bear recovery area. And so, you know, they concluded it's a high risk because it's silent and it's at high speed and often around blind corners. So there's no time for the bear to react or move away. And there's also a real good video on this by Dr. David Matson at the Grizzly Times website. Next, please. So we've known for quite a while that roads are a major threat to grizzlies, as well as motorized trails, but I think mechanized use, especially the frequency of it, there's large party size. I think it really does have a lot of impact on grizzlies. And in fact, Chris Servine told the Mountain Journal that he has grave concerns over the impacts of mountain biking on grizzly bears. Next, please. So this is just kind of a summary of road and motorized trail density impacts. You can see if you got no roads, a roadless area, everything's looking real good. As soon as you go to a mile, you know, the growth rate is not growing anymore. The den selection goes down to 70%. And then you can see as you get all the way down, things really go south to the point where there's no den selection probability. Next, please. There's also trail damage. It's not just the impacts on wildlife, but on soils and water quality. This is in the buffalo horn from motorcycle damage. Next, please. So in the end, I think, you know, if we want to keep grizzly bears on the landscape and other wildlife, we have to consider what we're doing. And I really do think that all the uses that are allowed either under the agreement or in the revised forest plan do fragment the Gallatin range and do cause impacts. And so I think the standard is the scientific one from the NOS letter. I think that there's a lot of justification for that. Next, please. And next, please. And that's what I've got for you, and I'd be happy to answer any questions. Thank you.